Happy Pride! This time on Poll Hub, it's LGBTQ Pride Month with the big parades in New York and San Francisco this weekend, so we thought it would be a good time to check in on the progress made by the queer community, particularly one area that has long been tracked by public opinion polls. That is same-sex marriage, and it's a historically fast-moving social issue. Then, president after president promised to do something about America's allegedly crumbling infrastructure. Joe Biden's no different. The past couple of attempts have failed, but how do Americans see Biden's new bipartisan push? And we'll end with a fun fact near and dear to Lee's heart. So, let's play ball. Oh, that was a spoiler. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Meringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
June is around the U.S. and around the world. Pride Month. Used to be Gay Pride Month. Now it's LGBTQ, maybe a plus sign, Pride Month. And there are parades in New York and San Francisco, as we mentioned. The big ones are back post-COVID this year, this weekend. And so we thought it would be good, as we mentioned, to look at an issue that has been very central to the gay movement, but also has been one of the fastest moving social changes in terms of American opinion of anything in the modern era. And I'm going to, in a bit, compare it to one other because I did this as a reporter early on in probably 2000 or 2001. There were early talks about, like in Hawaii and a couple other states, about passing same-sex marriage long before it happened. And I remember one of the people at the Marriage Equality Project in New York saying, well, you should look at this compared to some other things and see where we're at and see how long it's going to take. And they were wrong. It's really interesting how quickly this has changed. What are some of the numbers that we see now about Americans' acceptance of same-sex marriage?
Well, you're certainly right, Jay. This is often held up as an issue in public opinion, which is very, very unusual. And I think it had a tipping point in the mid-90s with DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage at the federal level as the union of one man to one woman. And Gallup began tracking the question of whether there should be marriages between same-sex couples and whether those should be recognized by law and have the same rights as traditional marriages in 1996. At that time, 68% of Americans felt that marriage should be between a man and a woman. Only 27% supported same-sex marriage. And so look, as you're certainly correct in saying, looking at that wide gap, looking at how other issues have progressed over time, it looked like something that would take decades. In 2011, those numbers changed and that was the first time the majority of Americans believed that same-sex couples should marry and have a marriage that is recognized by law in the United States. Now, it certainly took some time beyond that to get this, legally adopted. But in terms of public opinion, this was a major, major transformation. To today, in Gallup's poll, in their values poll, which was just done this past May, we actually see that a wide majority of Americans, 70% of Americans, believe there should be same-sex marriage. Only 29% believe there should not be. And I think for this year, probably the biggest milestone that for the first time, majority of Republicans now support same-sex marriage at 55%.
So I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just about to, to wrap up that although it still has taken 25 years to see that change, which is no small time frame. It is an issue and a belief, an opinion, and change in impressions and perceptions that has really accelerated.
And I was looking at a poll this week that was done by CBS News YouGov, and people recognize that the change has been enormous. Over the past 50 years, progress in ending discrimination against LGBTQ people, great deal or some, 78%, not much or none, 22%. And on the question of same-sex marriage, 64% say legal, should be legal, 36% say not. That's the CBS most recent numbers, which parallel the Gallup numbers. So this begs the question, why? Why has this issue, for example, taken off on high speed, whereas movement in the direction of civil rights, for example, has been painfully slow over the decades? And this one just went into fast forward. So why?
There's a lot of, I think, people in the gay community who believe it's because people started coming out more. And when you know somebody, you have someone in your family or near you that is gay, it's a lot harder to look them in the eye and say, you shouldn't get married. We know that in terms of race, in America, there actually is a lot of segregation, community segregation, social segregation. And that's at least some, theorists and some scholars that have looked at this, that is what they have said, is that they believe at least part of this had to do with the number of people, that basically came out of the closet, and that forced the issue at a family level. The thing I was mentioning earlier is the comparison that we did in a story back, 2 decades ago, was anti-miscegenation. And Gallup asked that question over a period of years as well about, do you think that Black people of opposite races, or different races, not opposite, different races, or between Blacks and whites, the question changed over the years, it should be legal for them to get married, or that you approve of their marriages. And when Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court ruling that made it illegal to deny people of different races marriage licenses, which was illegal in 1967 in many states to do that. A year later, Gallup asked that question, and only 20% of Americans, only 1 in 5 Americans thought that it was right that people of different races should get married. How long do you think it took before that line crossed? You talked about the line crossing in same-sex marriage where approval crossed disapproval about 15 years after they first polled. How long do you think it took for that line to cross on anti-miscegenation?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it hasn't.
No, it has.
No, it has.
I was afraid you were going to slow me
No,
off
it's not
there.
a trick question.
Okay.
It was when Bill Clinton's second term,
sure. Wow.
late
Okay.
90s,
Well,
it finally crossed. In
I'm only partially wrong.
In 1995, it was still 48% disapproved. So now it's 87%. It was last polled in 2013. They stopped polling it. But it does show you that decades in that case, for something that seems so fundamental, it took decades to happen, and it does show the relative speed with which same-sex marriage
and then not too soon after, we elect a president who was a product of a biracial marriage.
Yeah. And I think then in terms of same-sex marriage, then it looks forward to, we have trans rights issues now. How quickly do those move? There's, those are still very divisive. The bathroom, we've asked questions about this in some of our polls. Bathrooms, sports teams, trans rights is kind of the next frontier. And there's no way to know, but I'm curious to see if this also moves more quickly than other social issues have in the past.
And there's still a lot of discrimination, but I think that the debate and the conversation is very different.
So infrastructure, Lee. We have been talking on this program for years about the lack of bipartisanship, or the partisanship is more like it. And as we sit here, we're recording on Wednesday, there are 2 seems like a reasonable chance there might be a broad bipartisan bill spending $1 trillion or more on infrastructure. What happened? What has happened to this world?
People are, to continue your analogy, people are seeing bridges, shaking, tunnels that they're afraid to drive into, potholes everywhere. And if there's nothing like seeing it in your own neighborhood to think, yeah, maybe we need to invest in something that along the lines of infrastructure. Barb, you see some of the numbers there, which talk about some of the current support. Maybe you should start with those, and then we
Well,
can.
the thing is, I mean, when you look at public opinion, not Washington opinion, I mean, there's a very broad consensus that we need to do something about infrastructure. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me was actually a Fox News poll, which asked whether each of the following things is a major threat to the stability of the United States, a minor threat, or no threat at all. And 59% of Americans actually agreed that the nation's decaying infrastructure is a major threat to the stability of the United States. And another 31% at least described it as a threat. So we don't get much more of a consensus on an issue, particularly during these polarizing times, as that. So it was, I don't know, I think it was amazing to me that the fact that the conversation in Washington deteriorated so quickly. But Jay, you do mention the fact that, it may have been more posturing than actually people, kind of just standing on one side or the other to negotiate for this bill. But it's something that everybody is really eager to put forward. And maybe another case where public opinion is helping to drive legislation.
I think it is interesting when when you say, hey, is infrastructure important? Yes. Hey, do you like the bill? Yes. But then you start getting into the nitty gritty. Well, the trade-offs, for instance, it costs a lot of money and you've got to pay for that somehow. And do you want to pay through gas taxes or raising taxes on the rich? Those are the things that trip up, a bipartisan bill and may still trip up a bipartisan bill. And in that Monmouth poll in June, just a couple of weeks ago, they asked the broad question, do you support the bill? Sure, yeah, 49% strongly support it, 19% somewhat support it. But then they also asked, are you concerned that spending on these plans could lead to inflation, for instance? And 47% are very concerned and 24% are somewhat concerned, which are very similar numbers to, yes, I think it's important that you pass the infrastructure bill. So I think it's interesting that when you break these things down, you're hearing Americans kind of saying both sides. So Republicans can argue, well, it's going to lead to inflation. We don't want to spend this money by raising taxes or doing these things. And people generally are saying, yeah, that's true. And Democrats are saying, we need to spend this money because of infrastructure. Yeah, that's true. So public opinion is leading, but also public opinion is leading in both directions.
Well, I think that though that I think we've seen public opinion in a number of areas be very supportive for things that society needs to do together, a country needs to do together. Infrastructure is one of those things where you can't go out and pave your road. You can't fix the bridge over the creek around the corner. It's something that communities have to do together, and it has to be coordinated. So I think infrastructure, in that sense, is something that people can really come to terms with. And what I think also, besides the money, and I think this is another issue that it taps into, is just this trust in government, and whether if you give government all of this money and you say we're going to be spending it on these things, is it really going to be spent on these particular things? And are we going to literally see the bricks and mortar, around the country? We see that in many institutions, but particularly government, that distrust that has eroded over time. And that becomes a real concern, probably even beyond the spending, because I think most people do think this is a good value. They just want to make sure that they're getting that good value for their dollar.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this because I think it's in the present context. We're now opening up the economy. We're coming out of, at least I hope permanently, but certainly temporarily, the kind of horror that we've all lived through and experienced the last year and a few months. And so we come back and we see, and to your point, Barb, people saw government doing something like making vaccines and distributing vaccines. Not everybody wants it, but most people have. So the role of government and what the potential for government is shifting right now. The good part of that is it's a positive view that maybe things can move forward. The bad part is, as Jay alluded to, people are seeing this inflation starting and take root. And there's a concern about that. I don't think it's clear yet whether we're in some kind of inflationary period, or this may just be part of the opening up because we had so much pent up demand. And now things are just, getting a little bit out of control as people try to catch up in terms of making profits and the like. But I will switch to one other point I wanted to make, and that Joe Biden, unlike other presidents, I'm thinking back of Barack Obama, the Joe Biden effort seems to be to shoot high and then backpedal a little bit and come up with some consensus. This is a more of an old school technique where there is somewhere a compromise that can be reached, but you don't start with your end game position. You start by asking for things that are going to force the other side to move off of where they are. And so the question is that what Biden's up to? Are we about to get some kind of significant $1 trillion piece of legislation, even if it doesn't have the broader, newer, contemporary definition of what infrastructure is all about?
Well, one thing about this bipartisan thing, I mean, he's been putting his eggs in that basket for this bill, and progressives in the party are not particularly happy about that, as we're beginning to see. But if one of those questions that I alluded to is from that Monmouth poll, what would you like to see happen with these spending plans? Pass them as is, even if they don't get bipartisan support. Significantly cut them in order to get bipartisan support, or not pass them at all, even if they have bipartisan support. 46% say pass them as is, even if they don't get bipartisan support. That's the plurality. That's the biggest number. Only 22% significantly cut them to get bipartisan support. So Biden wants bipartisanship more than, at least in this poll, Americans do. And I just wonder if, in this case, is Biden ahead of American public opinion on that? Is bipartisanship worth what he's doing, or is it a product of necessity? In other words, he's not going to get it. Manchin and Sinema and other Democrats, you got to get 60 to get anything passed. He's got to get Republicans, unless you're going to go reconciliation, and Manchin and Sinema may not do that. Is this him being ahead of public opinion, or is this him basically looking at the reality of Washington, which he understands better than almost anybody, being in the Senate forever, and saying, here's how we go about doing it? In other words, what you're saying, Lee, is he just being the KG operator, the political operator?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's the big question we're going to find out.
Well,
I think it's the latter, but Barb, what were you going to say?
Well, the thing is, if you look at that question, yes, 46% say pass them as is, and if you add up people who identify as Democrats and independents who lean Democratic, you probably get about 46%. And the fact that this has clearly been identified as a Biden bill, we have that partisan polarization, and it gets identified, as a Democrat or Republican bill, and then significantly cut or not pass at all. Well, now you've also got 46%. So I think he's seeing certainly a divided nation here. Although in concept, this is something where there is a very strong consensus. Perhaps redefining redefining what infrastructure is to include some of the broader proposals he had is not worth that political capital, so that we can at least move forward on what we all agree on.
Well, an issue we will be no doubt following, because this is not going away anytime soon, one way or the other. But and I actually have a question for Jay DeDapper, and this will test a lot of your knowledge.
I have no knowledge on this topic.
Well, no, you don't know for sure. Let me ask you. I may be asking you a slightly different question. Okay, I'm going to mention 3 names, and I'm going to ask you a question about them: Lefty Gomez, Red Ruffing, and Red Ralph. Are these 3 people part of the new AOC Progressive Coalition or members of the 1938 New York Yankees?
Oh, I thought the other option would be a honky-tonk country band playing down at the bar across the river in Newburgh.
Well,
I'm going to go with they're part of the 1938 Yankees squad.
Well, see, and now you always say you don't have great knowledge of sports, and every time I ask you a sports question, you just hit it out of the park, as it were.
As it were.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
why are you asking me that question? What
well, because in 1938, George Gallup decided, hey, we're going to find out.
And it
about
was probably the real original George Gallup.
Yes.
If it was 1938.
Absolutely. This is
the dawn of public opinion polls.
Yes.
This is not the bricks and mortar Gallup that we know today.
No,
this is the people knocking on doors and showing up at doorsteps, and
yeah, and this is literally the good old days, because they asked, have the Yankees, the fact that they've won 3 consecutive World Series, has this lessened your interest in big league baseball? And the answer they got, 54% said no, only 14% said yes. This team included such Hall of Famers as Lou Gehrig. It was Joe DiMaggio's first year as a Yankee, and they beat the Chicago Cubs 4-0. Clearly in the 1990s, in the Derek Jeter, Mariano Rivera, Paul O'Neill era, they went to multiple consecutive victories. But we're right now, what do we say, in a bit of a slump here. So yes, the polls definitely showed that baseball would survive the Yankees. It might give birth to Yankee haters, which are a popular, even if misguided group.
So does this question, did it make you nostalgic for the times when the Yankees actually were winning?
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it's getting tough here. We have sports players who kind of like are DHs. They run 90 feet to first base, and then they're out 3 weeks with an oblique injury. And I don't even know what that means, but it seems to take some time to heal. And it's a very different era for sure. One that the pinstripes are not necessarily winning with the frequency I would certainly want, but
that was the definition of inside baseball right there.
Yes.
Well, Lee, I know it's no consolation, but that other New York team isn't having such a bad season.
You mean that expansion team, the Mets? Yes, you can tell where my feelings are on this. But anyway, and that is misnamed a fun fact of the day. But hope does spring eternal every time the baseball is being played, and every spring. And now we're getting into the summer, and maybe the Yankees will find some magic touch from the past and make a march to the pennant. Wishful thinking, unfortunately, on my part.
And that'll do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor. Ashley Marcinek is our production assistant. And Marcella Bettman is our editor. Thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University for providing us with the ability to look back at survey questions over the decades, including those Yankees questions back in the 1930s. If you have questions or comments, reach out to us on social media. That's the best way to be in touch. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. And if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews help other folks find us. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. That way the latest episode will appear in your inbox the second we release it. We'll see you next week.